Hey everyone, this is Peter Zablocki, the host of the Daily History Shorts podcast. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. If this is your first time stopping by, I hope you stick around and return tomorrow for more fun history. And if you enjoy these Friday conversation series, you can always find the entire backlog of conversations with historians, authors, Pulitzer Prize winners, and much more under the Conversations tab on our website at www.historyshortspodcast.com.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
Today's conversation is proudly brought to you by The Collector, your destination for captivating stories that teach, inform, and inspire millions of readers every day. From ancient history to today's defining moments, from philosophy and art to exclusive interviews, discover more at thecollector.com. Today we dive into the brutal, forgotten opening chapter of the Iraq War. Before Baghdad fell, before the insurgency exploded, and before most Americans even knew we were in a war, a savage, close-quarters battle in 2004 that left dozens of Marines dead tested the limits of military planning and marked what some now call the true beginning of America's war in Iraq. Joining me today is Gregg Zoroya, longtime journalist and author of the gripping new book, Unremitting, the Marine Bastard Battalion, and this savage battle that marked the true start of America's war in Iraq. Gregg has spent years reporting on war, trauma, and the lives of veterans, and in this new book, he gives us not only a battlefield account, but a sobering meditation on the costs of war and the stories we choose to remember. Gregg, thank you so much for taking the time to be here. I really appreciate it.
It's my pleasure.
What drew you to tell the story of the Bastard Battalion, and could you provide some context to the events that are depicted in your book?
Certainly. So I had actually, when I was a reporter for USA Today doing war coverage, I had covered the invasion. I'd been on the ground with those folks, and so that was a situation where they had gone better than they expected. The casualties were fairly light, and the country was kind of stunned after that. And it was quiet for a number of months for the most part. 6 months later, the insurgency began to kind of organize itself, and then suddenly, almost a year after the invasion ended in April of 2004, it just exploded. And I was going in and out of Iraq and Afghanistan doing stories, and always keeping my eye open for things. And I came across a letter that was written to the families of the 2nd Battalion, 4th Marines, whose nickname is the Magnificent Bastards, by their battalion commander. And he was talking about what they had just been through. And it was a shocker, because he was talking about how he'd lost these men and how they'd fought so bravely and how they'd been attacked by this evil enemy and that they'd caught them by surprise. And I just wasn't aware of this. And the fact was that when the violence erupted in April of 2004, much of the public attention was on what was happening in Fallujah, which was where they had launched an offensive against an insurgent stronghold there, and very little on Ramadi, which is the capital of Al-Anbar province, and a larger city than Fallujah. It's about 500,000 people at the time, and where there was a lone battalion of Marines, the 2nd Battalion, 4th Marines, and they'd come under attack. And so I made arrangements to go out there. I got to the city. I interviewed the principals and did a 2-part series for USA Today. But I always thought there was a book in that. And when the time came and I had the opportunity to finally do it, I went back at my notes, and I fortunately still had them after all those years, and then started a series of interviews. And of course, like so many stories, as you peel back the onion, you find more and more there that you didn't even know about.
Yeah, and the stories are really touching and very gripping, touching, but also graphic. I'm reading this and I'm thinking, my son's 17, and you're talking about kids that are only a year or two removed from his age. and the things that they're experiencing. I mean, my son can barely tie his shoes, so it's like, I'm like, it's surreal reading about this and what these people actually went through. You refer to this kind of as a turning point, right, for both the Iraqi war and the Marines who fought in this battle. And you kind of refer to it as the true start of the war in Iraq. Can you kind of elaborate on that, why that would be considered the true start of the war in Iraq? And also maybe how this event reshaped the Marines' mission going forward.
Well, the key thing about this was the enemy, and I talked to Joe Dunford about this, who was later the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and at the time he was the second in command of the First Marine Division, and he said that what was happening there in Ramadi was that the enemy attack. What basically was happening is that while the Marines launched an offensive against the insurgents in Fallujah, just down the road, the insurgency launched an offensive against this Marine battalion and had what Dunford characterized was they took the initiative. They had the initiative in that attack. They chose the time and place, and they launched a series of very complicated attacks against the battalion. And so what you had in actually then throughout the deployment, which was a dangerous deployment for the 7 months they were there, you had this kind of a situation where the enemy was launching, if not IEDs, they had snipers, they had gunfights that were underway, and so you had the kind of grinding insurgency that was really at a height there in Ramadi, and that would characterize the war for the next 7 or 8 years until it finally concluded. And you had also some of the issues that would characterize what was happening to the troops during the fighting, not just in Iraq but in Afghanistan. You had larger numbers of Marines and sailors suffering post-traumatic stress disorder. You had the surfacing of blast-related traumatic brain injury because IEDs became one of the weapons of choice in Ramadi to a higher scale than it had been previously. And then you had this tragic consequence when some of these guys went home where their demons kind of drove them to suicide. And suicide rates in the military, beginning about that time, started to rise at an incredible level. The military had always had suicide rates that were lower than the public average because, for obvious reasons, it was a structured society. The members of the military always had their lives taken care of. They had a steady income, that sort of thing. But during the war on terror, something changed, and you had higher and higher rates of suicide. And so, kind of those three evils really kind of surfaced at a great degree with some of the guys with 2-4, and they end up characterizing much of the war after that. In addition, the violence that broke out in April 2004 was widespread throughout Iraq, but some of probably the toughest, at least according to Dunford and even Jim Mattis, and who I interviewed for the book, was right in Ramadi. Mattis said that he thought the Marines fighting in Ramadi saw their toughest combat since Vietnam.
When I was reading your book, you were writing about the IEDs. It was like the calm before the storm, but it wasn't really calm. That was so nerve-wracking just reading about that. You bring up this point of the vehicles not being properly equipped, and people saying, how are we losing lives because no one's thinking about properly modifying these vehicles, right? It's like we were not prepared for that type of warfare.
Yeah, that was one of the things that struck me, was that among the other issues that developed there that characterized the war was the one about armored vehicles. I mean, armored vehicles would become a state of art for the military in the years going forward. Large V-shaped bottom hull vehicles that would rumble around the terrain, designed specifically to withstand these IEDs. Those were available; they were on the market, but the military really hadn't embraced them when the battalion showed up in Iraq, and so they were driving around initially in thin-skinned Humvees that were very dangerous, and they tried to augment them with bolted-on steel. They called it hillbilly armor, and but it never really worked. And so it was a highly dangerous situation where they freely admit, their senior enlisted officers and others, that they wouldn't have lost as many people if they had better armored vehicles.
You describe savage, close quarter fighting and immense psychological tolls throughout the book. How did the Marines that you spoke to make sense of this violence that they both experienced and carried out?
Yeah, I think the problem is that some of them are still struggling with that. One fellow that I talked to, who was a young Marine who stayed in touch with me after I embedded with the unit and then interviewed at length. I mean, he went through some combat where he killed a large number of the enemy who had him and another Marine cornered in, of all things, a carport. And as they came around the corner, they just kept shooting them down. And it was a horrific incident. His initial reaction after that happened was a certain amount of pride that he'd managed to do what a soldier does and survive that combat. But as the years went by, he couldn't understand exactly what was achieved there and why why he was put in that position. I mean, they were many of these people he thought were really defending their territory from these foreigners who were there, and so he struggled with that, and still to this day he has been diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder. There were high rates of it in the battalion at the time, and so they're still trying to kind of square their experience with what happened and what how they could survive that and go on. That's one of the things that drives me to write these stories, is that I've always been intrigued with the individual soldier and how they come to where they are, how they chose that, what their experience is like, and how they try to endure it. And this situation was just rife with those examples.
So your research includes interviews, but also letters, right? And you look at diary entries that you mention often, after action reports. Were there any personal stories or documents that particularly kind of stood out to you, that you right now sitting here remember the moment that you looked at this document, made this interview, or read this letter? And how did that kind of influence how you structured the book's narrative?
Well, one of the things that was a perfect example of that was, I mean, diaries are like a gold mine. As a writer, I'm sure you appreciate that. And so if somebody has a diary and then they're willing to share it, you just get all lathered up about the possibility of seeing what they said, because it's contemporaneous, it's heartfelt, and they're just kind of pouring their thoughts and feelings into this. So some of the diaries I got were really evocative. One in particular was by a nurse, and she's a key character in the book, an Army nurse. She was the only person, to give an idea of how unprepared they were for this, with the MASH unit that was there for the Army, that was treating the Marines who were wounded, who had been trained in critical care, the kind of wounded and damaged people that they were going to be facing. And so she kept a diary. She became a crucial member of that unit and a leader. And she kept this diary about her experiences. And in there, the emotions were so raw about everything and some of it I couldn't include because it went some way far afield from the topic. But there was frustrations about her personal relationships with her husband, and then with other members of the unit, and of course women, and some of the problems they face with male leaders, but then also just the casualties and how she was affected by that, and how they tried so hard to save these young men, and what she did to try to help them. And it was like a gold mine. And it really helped me in terms of realizing, this was a way of looking on the inside. You always try to look on the inside, and this gave you a glimpse of that. And I felt fortunate that I could have material like that to tell this story.
When you write a book, a lot of it is left outside the book because you have constraints of, wording and so on and so forth. Like, what are you working on now? Where do you take this story next?
The one untold story that's out there, of course, is kind of the Iraqi side of this. And it was something that I really wanted to get into. I struggled with that, and I didn't have the resources to be able to do it as I wanted to do it. So that's an untold story. But there's other ideas that crop up. I'm particularly intrigued now, particularly after Jody Schroeder's diary of the experience of women in the military and what they have to endure on top of all the other strains that any average soldier or Marine has to go through. And so that's an area that I'm very interested in and trying to explore that further.
So you've been in conflicts, you've covered conflicts over the years. How does that feel looking at it as a civilian that's technically documenting history as it's happening? Is there a certain weight of responsibility, certain fear of trying to get it right? Because ultimately it's your book, but also your research that one day will be cited as to, the witness of what happened.
For one, I didn't really think of it in those long-term ways. I think it would have been smart if I had, but what I was doing was just kind of embarking on an adventure. I mean, the first time I was overseas was, it dates me, but was in the early 90s in Somalia. And then of course I went immediately after 9/11. And the challenge is, it's the hardest work in the world. It seems to me your challenges are myriad. You have to deal with communication issues and trying to physically get where you need to get. And of course there's the effort of trying to avoid, getting harmed in any way. But it is just what you're dealing with when you reach the people and you talk to them. It's so raw, and they're in the middle of this horrific story, and you get a chance to hear what they have to say, or in some cases witness what they do. um, and it's so much more powerful than even when you talk to them years later and they try to recollect it.
Yeah.
What they have to say at the time about it is also, it
Raw.
seems to carry, it seems to carry much more emotion and immediacy, and is much more honest. It's not as filtered as it becomes over the years, right? I mean, it's just right out there. They're just telling you right off the bat what's happening, and so it's just, I mean, it's the most exciting kind of work in the world, and I was drawn to it.
Have you heard from any of the people that you mentioned in this book or their families since you wrote this book?
I got to say that there's always a certain element of nervousness when you write these books. Obviously, it's about people who are still out there, still relatively young, and they have their lives ahead of them. And these guys are all pushing 40 or a little bit, or in the early 40s. And the most satisfying thing I've had so far, and you don't know what's ahead, but they've all seemed universally to be very happy with the book, and they seem to be, mostly they seem very, very. I mean, there's different reactions. Sometimes they would send me notes describing what they went through as they read it. How they would put it down, had to go take a walk, had to kind of contend with the emotions that it brought up with them, but then they came back and continued to read it or to listen to it. Somebody said they got it at 7 o'clock in the morning and they went through it and finished it that night in one day. But they were just, I mean, the most heartfelt messages are the ones that said that they were grateful that their story had been told.
It kind of gives you certain power as a historian, as a writer, to tell people's stories that normally they would be buried. No one would ever hear these stories.
I mean, you feel honored in a way to be able to preserve that history and what their experience was. And you talked about the graphic aspect of the book, and my feeling was always, this is war, and this is a form of political action in its most dire format, and so this is what we as a people engage in through our leaders, and so this is what you choose, this is what it is, and I think being as honest as you can about what happened to these guys, what their experiences have been, how they've tried to deal with it or not deal with it, is all part of the story.
So shifting gears to finish off on a lighter note, I always ask this question. I mean, I think it's a fun question. I'm not sure if it is, but I always ask all of my writers, if I was to look at your bookcase that you've had since birth, so your whole life bookcase, and this doesn't have to be history, what two books are definitely somewhere on that bookshelf?
Well, I mean, you've interviewed James McPherson. His one volume history of the Civil War is still today, in my mind, just a incredible classic. I had the honor of interviewing James McPherson, but the other one I like, in it kind of drives me to the what kind of work I do, is Stephen Ambrose and works he did on World War II, Band of Brothers, Citizen Soldier, just his way of really focusing on the individual combat soldier and what they've gone through. That was an inspiration for me, just to name two.
No, Stephen Ambrose, great storyteller.
The one thing he did when I was so I did a story about the opening of the D-Day Museum in New Orleans, which is a very cool museum if you've ever had a chance to see it.
Yeah.
He was involved in that, and he was there. So we toured the museum with him. I toured it with him, and there was a diorama on the landing on Omaha Beach, which was, of course, the horrific. And he said he just kind of confided in me that he wished he had been there. I thought, okay, it's cool to be a historian, but I'm not sure that you wish to be in the middle of that. But that was his thinking.
Gregg, where can my listeners go to learn more about your work and what's coming up next?
Well, let's see. So I have I have a Facebook page that has that talks about this book and my first book, which was about a paratrooper company that fought in the mountains of Afghanistan. It's kind of the same genre. It's called The Chosen Few. They were C Company, Chosen Company, and that can there's information there about both books, and they're available. I'm a modest book writer at this point.
I'll make sure I put all the links to your work in the description of this podcast. So, Gregg, thank you so much for taking the time. This was a great conversation.
Thanks, Peter. It was really a pleasure to talk with you.